I didn't scream. I didn't collapse into anyone's arms. I just stood there in my kitchen holding the phone so tight my knuckles ached, and I said, "Okay, I'll be there." That's how I found out my son was dead. 41 years old. A heart attack, they said. Perfectly healthy man, never smoked a day in his life, ran 5 miles every Saturday morning, and his heart just stopped. That's what they told me. I wrote it down on the back of an envelope because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. His name was Elijah, my only child, and I need you to understand what that means before I tell you the rest of this story, because if you don't understand that, none of what I did will make sense to you. I had Elijah when I was 22, in a 2-room apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina, with second-hand everything and a radiator that knocked all winter. His father left before Elijah's first birthday. It was just us after that. Just the two of us against everything. I worked double shifts at the hospital, dietary department. Not a nurse, not anything glamorous. And I put every dollar I could find toward his school fees, his shoes, his future. When he got into UNC on a partial scholarship, I cried for 2 hours straight in the parking lot of the Piggly Wiggly because I didn't want him to see me. He built everything himself, a financial consulting firm out of Raleigh. By the time he was 35, he had clients in 4 states. By 38, he had more money than I could picture in my mind. He bought me a house, a real house, not a big one, but mine, with a yard and a dishwasher and a front porch where I drink my coffee every morning. He called me every Sunday without fail, every single Sunday without fail. So when they told me his heart just stopped, I wrote it on the back of an envelope, and I said, "Okay," and then I sat down at my kitchen table and I didn't move for a very long time. His wife Claudine called me an hour later. She cried on the phone, beautiful theatrical crying, the kind that sounds like it was practiced. She said she was devastated. She said Elijah had complained of chest pain the night before, and she thought it was indigestion. She said she blamed herself. She said all the right things. I listened. I said, "Thank you for calling me." I hung up. I hadn't liked Claudine from the beginning, and I want to be honest about that because it matters. Not because she was wrong for him on the surface. She was educated, well-spoken, worked in commercial real estate. But there was something behind her eyes when she looked at Elijah that never sat right with me. Not love. Something more like calculation. I told myself I was being a protective mother. I told myself to stay in my lane. Elijah loved her, and that was what mattered. They'd been married 4 years when he died. The funeral was held on a Thursday. Grey November, the kind of cold that gets in through your coat. The church was full. Elijah knew everyone, and everyone came. I sat in the front row in my black dress, and I kept my hands folded in my lap, and I breathed. That was when I first saw the man I'll call his partner. I didn't know him well. I knew Elijah had brought on a business partner 2 years earlier, a man named Garrett, his age, MBA from Duke, handsome in the way that makes you not quite trust it. Elijah had mentioned him a handful of times on our Sunday calls, said he was sharp, said having a partner let him think bigger. Garrett sat 3 rows back. He cried, or he did something with his face that looked like crying. After the service, when people were standing around the way people do, he made his way to me. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Elijah talked about you all the time. He loved you so much." I said, "Thank you." Then he leaned in, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive, and he said, almost quietly, almost gently, "You don't need to worry about anything. I'll take care of the business. I know how to manage these things better than most." I looked at him. He smiled and moved away. I stood there and I thought, that is a strange thing to say to a woman who just buried her son. I didn't cry at the funeral. I want to be clear about that, not because I'm strong, but because the grief was so large I couldn't find the edges of it. You don't cry when something is that big. You just breathe and you wait. I went home that night and I sat at the kitchen table again, same chair, and I thought about what Garrett had said. I know how to manage these things better than most, and I thought about the way Claudine had cried on the phone, practiced and perfect. And I thought about Elijah, 35 miles every week. No smoking, no drinking, occasional glass of wine at dinner. And his heart just stopped at 41. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years in hospital dietary services. I am not a medical professional, but I know what a healthy person looks like, and I knew my son. I called his doctor the next morning. His primary care physician, a man he'd been seeing for 6 years. I told him I was Elijah's mother, and I needed to understand what had happened. He was kind but careful. He said Elijah had been in for a routine checkup 8 months prior, and everything looked excellent. No cardiac risk factors, no family history. He said these things sometimes just happen. I said, "Did anyone request a toxicology screen?" He paused. He said the death had been ruled natural causes. He said a tox screen wasn't standard in those circumstances. I said, "I'd like to request one." He said that would need to come through the medical examiner's office and that the family, meaning Claudine, would need to initiate it. I thanked him and hung up. I called Claudine. I told her I thought we should ask for a toxicology report, just for our own peace of mind. She said, and I remember this exactly, "Oh, Loretta, the doctor's already told us what happened. We have to let him rest." Loretta. That's my name. She said it the way you say it to a child who is asking too many questions. I said, "Of course, you're right." I hung up and I started making a list. I am not the kind of woman who is easy to read. I learned that a long time ago, in that 2-room apartment, when being unreadable was the only card I had. I have a face that doesn't give much away. Elijah used to tease me about it, said I could beat anyone at poker and I'd never even held a deck of cards. So when I decided to find out what had happened to my son, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't pace. I didn't demand. I just got quiet and I got careful and I started paying attention to everything. The first thing I noticed was Claudine's timeline. She told the grief counselor at the funeral home that she'd called 911 immediately when Elijah collapsed. But when I talked to their neighbor, a retired woman named Mrs. Albright, who lives 2 doors down and has sharp eyes and not much to do, she said she'd seen the ambulance come. She said it seemed like a long time between when she heard something and when the ambulance arrived. Maybe 40 minutes. 40 minutes is a long time. The second thing I noticed was money. I'm not a wealthy woman, but I understood enough of Elijah's business to know that his firm was worth somewhere between $3 and $4 million in assets and contracts, plus another $2 million in personal savings and real estate. He had a will. He'd shown it to me 3 years ago. I was left a generous amount, and the bulk of his estate went to Claudine as his spouse, with provisions that the firm's assets be managed jointly between Claudine and Garrett during a transition period. I had a copy of that will. What I didn't know was whether it had been changed. I started making quiet calls. I called the estate attorney listed on Elijah's old will, a woman with a firm in downtown Raleigh. I told her I was his mother, and I had some questions. She was professional but limited. Attorney-client privilege doesn't die with the client in all circumstances, but she wasn't going to tell me everything. What she did tell me, in the careful way lawyers have of telling you things without exactly saying them, was that Elijah had come to see her approximately 11 months before his death. He had come alone, and he had made some updates. She wouldn't tell me what the updates were, but her tone when she said the word alone told me something. I thought about that for 3 days. Then I called Elijah's best friend, a man named Theodore, who'd known him since college. Theodore was grieving hard and openly the way men sometimes do when they finally let themselves, and when we talked he said something that lodged in my chest like a splinter. He said Elijah had called him about 6 months before he died, late at night, and he'd seemed off. "Worried?" Theodore said. "Not like himself. He'd said something about the business not feeling right, about feeling like things were being moved around without him knowing, about not being sure who he could trust. Theodore had told him to get some rest and call a lawyer if he was worried about the firm. He said Elijah had laughed and said, 'Yeah, you're probably right.' He never called Theodore back about it. I wrote all of this down, names, dates, what was said. I kept the notebook in my coat pocket. Then I started looking at Claudine. It took me about 2 weeks to see what I should have seen sooner. But grief makes you slow, even when you're trying to be fast. I noticed that Garrett's car was parked outside Elijah's house, Claudine's house, now 3 times in 1 week. I noticed that when I came to pick up some of Elijah's things, Claudine's manner had changed. She was less careful with me, faster to dismiss, like I had served my purpose, and she was done being gracious. I noticed that she was wearing a necklace I had never seen before, a thin gold chain with a pendant. Simple, expensive. Not Elijah's taste, not something he would have given her. I didn't say anything. I picked up my box of Elijah's things, his father's watch, a photo from his college graduation, some books, and I drove home. That night I called a private investigator. I found him through a woman at my church whose daughter had used him during a custody dispute. His name was Raymond, and he was a former Mecklenburg County Sheriff's deputy, and he charged $85 an hour, plus expenses, and I paid him out of the money Elijah had set aside for me. I told Raymond everything I knew. I told him about the timeline, about Theodore's call, about the will, about Garrett's visits. I told him about the attorney saying Elijah had come in alone 11 months before he died. Raymond listened without interrupting. Then he said, "What do you think you'll find?" I said. "I think my son was poisoned, and I think his wife and his business partner did it together." Raymond looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay, let's see what's there." It took him 6 weeks. What Raymond found, working methodically, the way good investigators do, was a thread. And when you pull a thread like that, it doesn't stop coming. Garrett and Claudine had been seeing each other for at least 18 months before Elijah died. Raymond found records of hotel stays in Durham and Charlotte, found a shared email account they used that Raymond's contact was able to access legally through a civil court process I didn't fully understand. He found emails, detailed, cold emails, the kind that tell you these were not two people swept up in passion, but two people running a plan. They had discussed the business. Garrett had been quietly shifting client relationships, moving contracts, making himself appear indispensable, while making Elijah appear less involved. The plan was to use the partnership agreement to claim majority operational control after Elijah's death, with Claudine as the cooperative spouse, who would sign whatever was needed. There was an email where Claudine mentioned something she had been adding to Elijah's morning smoothies. Raymond flagged that email immediately, and we took everything to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. I want to be honest about what the next several months were like, because I've heard people tell stories like this and make it sound clean, make it sound like the truth comes out, and justice falls like rain, neat and satisfying. It is not like that. It is depositions and waiting rooms and being told to be patient and being told they're working on it and trying not to call the investigator every day. It is sitting at your kitchen table at 2 a.m, wondering if you are wrong. If you have spent your grief on a theory, if Elijah really did just die. But I wasn't wrong. The medical examiner agreed to conduct an independent toxicological review based on the evidence Raymond had compiled. They found traces of digoxin, a cardiac medication that, in elevated doses, can trigger fatal arrhythmias and is difficult to detect unless you're specifically looking for it. Elijah had never been prescribed digoxin. He had no cardiac condition that would have warranted it. Someone had been giving it to him over a period of time. The SBI arrested Claudine and Garrett 14 months after Elijah's funeral. I was in my living room when Raymond called me. I was watching the news with the sound off. He said, "They've got them, Loretta." I said, "Both of them?" He said, "Both of them." I turned the TV off. I sat there in the quiet. I thought I would feel something enormous. Relief, maybe, or a kind of savage satisfaction. But what I felt, sitting in that room, was just very tired, and underneath the tired was something steady, something that had been holding me out for 14 months. And I thought, okay, Elijah. Okay. Claudine pled guilty to second-degree murder and accepted the sentence of 22 years. Her attorney argued that she had been manipulated by Garrett, that she was a woman under his influence. The prosecutor let me speak. I spoke for 4 minutes. I talked about my son. I talked about who he was, not what he achieved, not the firm, not the money, but who he was, the way he called every Sunday, the way he still asked my opinion even when he was 40 years old and knew more than I did about most things, the way he used to bring me $2 scratch tickets from the gas station and sit with me while I scratched them off, even though neither of us ever won. Garrett went to trial. He was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit fraud. He is serving life without the possibility of parole. The estate was a separate process, long and complicated, and I won't walk you through all of it because some of it I still don't entirely understand. What I know is that the firm's assets were frozen once the criminal case opened. Claudine forfeited her claim to Elijah's estate as part of her plea. After legal fees, after the civil claims filed by two clients whose contracts Garrett had manipulated, after everything that had to be settled, there was money left. Enough that I was able to establish a scholarship in Elijah's name at UNC, enough that the house on my front porch still belongs to me. It is not enough. It will never be enough. That is the plain truth of it. And I think people want me to say something different, something about how justice heals you, how finding the answer closes something. But the Sunday calls are still gone. The scratch tickets are still gone. I still reach for my phone sometimes on Sunday mornings, and I have to remember. What I will say is this. I was a dietary aide for 31 years. I raised my son alone in a 2-room apartment with a knocking radiator. I have never been anybody's idea of dangerous, and the people who looked at me at that funeral, who saw a grieving old woman in a black dress who would go home and be quiet and be grateful for whatever scraps she was allowed, they made a mistake. They saw what I let them see. That is the thing about spending your whole life being underestimated. Eventually, you learn to use it. I kept that envelope, the one I wrote the news on that first night. I kept it in the same notebook where I wrote down all the names and dates and things that were said. It sits in the drawer of my nightstand. Sometimes I take it out and I look at it and I think about that woman sitting alone at her kitchen table, not moving, not crying, just thinking. She knew something was wrong. She was right. I hope wherever you are, baby, I hope I made you proud. I've thought a lot about what made Garrett and Claudine believe they would get away with it, and I think the honest answer is, me. I made them believe it. Not on purpose, not at first. But a woman my age, in a black dress, crying quietly in a church pew, doesn't look like a threat to people like them. She looks like the end of the story. She looks like someone who will go home and grieve and eventually accept whatever she's handed. That miscalculation cost them everything. There's something I want to say carefully here, because I'm not interested in sounding wise after the fact. I didn't feel wise during any of it. I felt frightened and exhausted, and at 2 a.m, more times than I can count, I felt like a foolish old woman chasing a theory because she couldn't accept that her healthy son had simply died. Those nights were real. That doubt was real. Grief will do that. It will make you question the one clear thing you know, because knowing it means sitting with something almost unbearable. What I kept coming back to was this. I knew my son. I knew his body, his habits, his health, the way he'd looked the last time I saw him. 3 weeks before he died, when he came to Charlotte for my birthday and ate 2 pieces of my pound cake and looked tired but laughed easily and hugged me in the driveway for a long time before he got in his car. I know the difference between a man who is sick and a man who is well, and Elisha was well. That knowing, quiet, ordinary, maternal knowing was the only thing I had for a long time. No evidence, no investigator, no file, just the certainty that something was wrong, and the decision to trust that certainty even when everything official told me to let it go. I think that is what integrity actually looks like in practice, not the big dramatic version, the small daily version, choosing to honor what you know is true even when it costs you something, even when it's inconvenient, even when the people around you are gently, kindly suggesting you go home and rest. Claudine and Garrett were intelligent people. Garrett had a Duke MBA. Claudine was sharp and organized and had thought through the plan carefully. What they didn't have was any real respect for the people they were deceiving. They looked at Elijah and saw a revenue stream. They looked at me and saw an obstacle that would dissolve on its own. When you operate that way, when you treat other people as props in your own story, you stop paying attention to them as real forces in the world. You get sloppy. You get arrogant. And arrogance eventually will build you a perfect trap and walk you straight into it. Every choice they made came back. The emails they thought were private. The hotel stays. The 40 minutes Claudine waited before calling 911, none of it disappeared. It all sat quietly in the world, waiting to be found by someone who was paying attention. I am 63 years old. I raised my son alone, worked a job that nobody considered important, and never had the kind of power that makes people take you seriously in a room. And I brought down two people who thought they had outmaneuvered everyone because I refused to believe that the truth was something I had to accept on other people's terms. That is the thing I want to leave you with. Not a lesson exactly, more like something I earned the hard way and want to say out loud. You don't have to be powerful to be right. You don't have to be loud to be dangerous. You just have to know what you know and refuse to let anyone talk you out of it, and keep moving forward one quiet step at a time. Elijah, baby, I hope I made you proud.